We would bang on doors, walk in unannounced, walk in on weddings, walk in on funerals, and everything would stop and we'd vaccinate. Thinking about it years later, it was astounding that the Afghans put up with us the way they did, with such humor and welcoming.
It has a stark beauty all its own.
Actually in high school when Kennedy became president, and the first conference with my counselor as a freshman, and she said, do you have any idea what you want to do? I said, well, I want to go to college and then join the Peace Corps.
I just remember him talking about the Peace Corps in his speeches, and I thought, oh, that's something I'd really like to do. And then he died. I mean, he was assassinated. And I don't know, it just it was like a catalyst, some kind of a thing that just made me say, yeah.
When he mentioned the idea of Peace Corps, it just struck a chord in me, and I kept that in my head as something I'd like to do.
A Peace Corps recruiter came to UNCG and presented a program. She had been in Ethiopia, so she had all these great shots of Africa and talked about the life there.
My mother and father, they passed within 1 year, and I decided that I wanted something different. So I thought different, I always had a desire to travel, so I thought different would be going to the Peace Corps.
After having been exposed to a lot of Western education standards and ideals, I was very much intrigued with what people would be like without any Western education.
I had applied to go to Brazil because at the time in the 60s, the bossa nova was in. And I really loved that Latin beat, and I wanted to go where there was music and partying, right?
So I was doing a chagall on the refrigerator, and she went to get the mail, and she came back with a letter, and it said, oh, this is from the Peace Corps. And I went, oh, well, I've got paint on my, I'm working here. Open it up, and she goes, oh, they want you to be a smallpox vaccinator in Afghanistan. And I said, oh, would you go to the big map, big wall map in the foyer and see where that is? And so she went in and she goes, "Ooh, this is there." And I said, "Oh, that's great. Let's go."
The group was all women, and that was because the Peace Corps and the Afghan government and the World Health Organization felt that women could vaccinate Afghan women much more easily, culture-wise, than Afghan men could vaccinate Afghan women. The hard part is convincing people that this is a good thing. I'm not sick. Why should I get this thing? And how do I know it's not going to introduce some evil things into my body and I'll become bewitched? Or, you know, I mean, there were all sorts of reasons.
You know, I think if they had asked me if I wanted to be an English teacher, it wouldn't have had the same appeal. But vaccinating was something that I knew was beneficial. There was no doubt in my mind. Even having had no direct experience with smallpox, I didn't have any illusions as a history student that smallpox was anything but a scourge.
It sounded okay, you know, since I fainted at the sight of blood and, you know, couldn't stand the thought of getting shots. That was a little bit radical, but I don't know that I thought that much about it ahead of time at all.
My mother kept saying, you can't just go by yourself. You can't just go someplace like that by yourself. You don't know anybody. You know, how will you eat? How will you, where are you going to sleep? It was just all this anxiety. And I just said, no, I'm sure I'm going to be fine. Because it's the Peace Corps. It's the United States government. For heaven's sakes, they take care of people. You know, that's what they do. So off I went.
And we got to the place that was the training facility, which was in a beautiful place. I mean, it was outside Tucson. It was just gorgeous. And there were a bunch of other people who looked just like me. There were other people that had their little pumps on and their little dresses. And so we signed up and we filled out all our paperwork, and it was all very exciting.
Chris made you think that everything it wasn't easy. It was a challenge. There was humor around every corner. You just had to open yourself up to that.
I'm not very good at spoken languages. I had a little bit of German, but I didn't do well in spoken languages. And but it was interesting.
I loved learning Farsi. That to me was the best part.
I remember we had the sides up on our tent, and a dog came and slept in my cot with me one night, and was gone in the morning, and but it just like curled up in the back, around the back of my legs, and I know it really happened. It wasn't imagining this, but it just kind of seemed all part of this kind of magical place that we were.
They had us injecting oranges, and then we started injecting each other. It was into the first few days of training. Now, this is somebody who used to faint when she got a shot, and suddenly I'm giving shots to my friends, and they're giving shots to me.
What I learned in training probably was just how wonderful it feels to be part of a group of people with a goal, and not to feel judged. I didn't feel judged by my peers, and I just felt embraced.
Maybe I might not make it through the training because I didn't have real defined ideas about what I wanted, or I just didn't seem quite as goal-oriented.
I got the reputation of being kind of quiet.
The trainers thought I was a little bit flippant.
Something was brought up in a class about what would happen if somebody started to choke. And one of the staff people was telling us what to do if someone started to choke, and I raised my hand and said, would a tracheotomy be appropriate? And I could see, is she extreme?
I think everybody in the group was an achiever, one way or another, who so wanted to succeed that the more rigorous it was terribly appealing.
We were young, we were naive, and into doing whatever came next. And I think that certainly was the beginning of the bonding.
The favorite part, I think, of all the training that we had was really the Indian reservation when we went to the Apache White River.
That was my first real exposure to real poverty, walking back through the reservations. When you see something and it's making an impression on you, and you're losing a little bit of your girlish silliness, and that happens. And I remember that was the beginning of a change.
When we finished with training, we all went home at Christmas time to see the families and essentially say goodbye. And I remember my mother being so concerned and being absolutely convinced that I was going off to die.
Well, I recall flying over it and looking down and saying, who are we supposed to vaccinate? Because all we saw were undulating bare hills.
It was winter and there was snow, and all the buildings were mud and flat roofed. So we flew into the capital city, and we all looked down. And the first question is, okay, where is it?
They called it a city. I mean, it was not a city.
As we drove into town and got to the hotel, the sights and the smells, wood smoke and other smells, and donkeys in the streets and horns honking, and it was almost overwhelming.
We were going from Kabul up to Kunduz. And I remember them traveling so fast and being, on the wrong side of the road. And one of my friends, Jan, who was with us, said, slow down, slow down. And he said, well, it's a privilege to die.
One of the things that made a huge impression was a little boy that was right in front of the hotel that we were staying at. And there was snow all over the ground, and he was barefoot. And he had purple toes.
I remember seeing on the street terribly disfigured people in a way that I'd never seen.
I remember thinking, this country is only like 3 days away from my life, and yet it's just totally another world.
Everything is tied to the top of the camels, and the little kids are riding up there, and their pots and pans are hanging down, and all of their carpets and these tents that they put up and stuff like that, and they just go through this very traffic-laden streets, at their own pace. So we were in this traffic, and we hadn't seen any camels and stuff like that. We just been in the city, and we started shrieking and screaming. The taxi driver came to this, halt. What is the matter? Like that.
We're here. We're in Central Asia.
It was exciting, and it was scary. All eyes were on us when we walked in the door, and we sat down and got some rice, and the radio was turned up full blast. Some screaming Indian song, I think. It was very strange. I really felt that I was in a foreign place.
It was like a rebirth. We literally had to learn how to go to the bathroom a different way. We ate with our hands. So many of the little details of life we had to relearn.
It's very hard as a woman to find a place to go to the bathroom. You've got places that's absolutely flat. There's no foliage to hide behind. You're trying to find a place to squat that doesn't draw a crowd.
I remember one time the soldier, I said, I needed to go to the Tashnab, and he handed me a rock. And I thought that was to throw at the dogs, but it wasn't. They used rocks and mud clumps for toilet paper and bathroom tissue.
They didn't bathe very often. The compounds, the women in the compounds, they were over cooking fires, and there was a smell. But as time went on, we didn't bathe either, and we were hanging out in those compounds, and we all smelled the same. And I think you reach a point where you just let go of all of that.
Because it was so cold, the pipes froze. So when it came time to take a bath, there was no water. So they brought me a pot of tea, and that was the first. I decided to take a bath with that tea, and that was my first tea bath.
We thought we were covered up, and they thought we were naked.
We didn't know enough to dress like women, so we were dressed like men, with the Afghan, and I don't remember what the clothes were called, but, the long tunics and then the baggy, whatever they were. And so we were dressed like the Afghan men.
And an old grandma ran her. I was explaining who I was and what I was there for, and she wasn't sure that she should really let me in where the women were. And she had to run her hands up and down me to make sure that I really was who I said I was, because I was there in men's clothing and my hair was uncovered and it was short.
So what kind of ridiculous clothes does she have on? You know, is she trying to look like that? Is that a mistake?
I remember one time having them wonder if I was a boy, you know, and I don't remember if they felt my body, but they were trying to be sure that I wasn't, you know, a man. And I didn't think I looked like a man, but just the fact that I was alone out there and I was doing that type of a job, I'm sure just brought up all kinds of curiosity for them.
I believe I was washing out probably my underwear one day or something, and because they don't, in the village, I mean, they didn't have underwear. So it was like, what is that? You know, a bra? I mean, that's unusual. So those kind of things they wanted to know about, and they would hold it up and they would look at it, you know, and this kind of thing. And then the panties, I don't know what color they were, probably white, you know. And I said, well, I'm just going to wash them out, and, you know. And they would hold them up and look at them. There was an older woman who tried them on, I remember, to see how they fit. And then she wouldn't give them back. So I told her she could have them.
There was one time when we went into a village and it had some ponds. And it was in the summer, it was when it was hot, and so we jumped into the ponds. Well, unfortunately, we learned later that was their drinking water.
I really had no idea what it was going to be like. But I'll tell you one thing, it was out of the office.
I met an Afghan poet, and he said, and I talked to him about what I should do with these ladies, and he said, teach them how to wait. And that was a beautiful piece of advice, because what they did mostly was waiting.
They would let us know if they had gotten all the permits together and we were ready to go or not. And so there would be days and days and days where we'd be all ready to go and then learn by midday that we weren't going.
We'd be told we're going to be going out for a 2-week trip. And each day somebody would go to the office to say, is it today? And then you'd be told, no, not today. Well, is it tomorrow? Well, we don't know. We'll tell you tomorrow. And I had the American sense of time. I wanted it to happen at a point so I could make my plans, set my mind up for it. This waiting for things to happen was hard.
We had to wait, but we didn't know really what we were waiting for. But we did have to wait. And finally somebody would come and say, okay, let's go.
Our very first time out, we were armed with our needles and our freeze-dried vaccine. I was with another volunteer, and at that time we weren't splitting up as we did later. So we were together with our team, and our language wasn't quite as adept. We weren't as skilled as we later became, and so there was a little bit of confusion, and we ended up at this enormous dogfight. And Lynn and I were the only 2 women. There were hundreds, literally hundreds of men and their huge dogs, and that's what we did the first day.
One of those first days, and I was struggling up a slippery slope between houses, and I was having trouble getting up there with my field boots, and I had a nice warm coat and everything. And this little girl who was about 5 years old was carrying a bucket of water on her head and a baby on her back in plastic flip-flops coming up the hill with me.
As we went from village to village, we got all 3 meals from the villages.
In the evening, they would serve us something like maybe, you know, the typical charlois, the soup with the bread and maybe an egg or 2 with it. Nothing particularly elaborate, but probably the best that they had to offer.
We would eat with our hands, of course. They would bring in these platters of rice and the meat and all this kind of stuff. And so you got used to it for a while, eating greasy rice.
Some people put too much fat in it. And I remember putting my hands into the rice and come out with a wax hand.
You know, when they cook the sheep, they cook the whole thing. So then they have the head on a whole big platter. That was one day. And then they pop the eyes out and they present them to you to eat because you're the guest.
We had a kind of a soup that was just made of fat, like fat from sheep. I couldn't get it down. I mean, I was hungry, but I just could not get it down because it was basically just water with fat in it.
You had to eat what was put in front of you. And so I think a lot of us got sick, and we had amoebic dysentery and giardiasis and worms, and some people had hepatitis and trachoma in your eyes.
There were areas that were so hot that the flies died. That was good. And there were areas that were so cold that the ink in children's, in students' pens froze.
We were way out in the middle of sort of nowhere out there, and many of the villagers had never even seen a Western woman, well, a Western person, period.
I mean, I went to a village where, and I'm sure it's not the first one, but somebody told me it was the first car they'd seen that brought us there to vaccinate.
Families lived in these big compounds, and so we would basically go from compound to compound, and they were the big wooden doors, and you'd bang on the wooden door, and it was usually the women that were all home, and a couple of them would come to the door, and they'd squeak the door open, and they just kind of look and ask, sort of, who are these people?
We were in sales. First time I'm the kid who got run out of Girl Scouts because I couldn't sell any cookies. I didn't, here I am door to door, and it's get your red hot vaccination.
The male vaccinators were outside, and I had gotten into the compound to vaccinate, and there was a woman in there with a babe at breast, and she was breastfeeding. And all of a sudden, I don't know why, but the vaccinator I was with, one or two of the fellows, decided they had to come in. So the first thing I thought of covering was her breast. Well, that's not what she did. She immediately went to cover her head, and I'm thinking, my gosh, how different. What a unique experience as far as what's important.
Sometimes the RBOB, the mayor, would sort of send out the word, and that was effective. Sometimes you just had to talk your way into it.
Especially if you had a strong woman, a grandma or somebody else who had some real stature in that household. You had to convince her before she would let anybody else, and she might have you start with her.
I try to get a woman that, I'd sort of feel her skin and try to get someone that had pretty thick skin, and so I'd get them first, and they'd realize that, it didn't hurt, and they'd pass the word, and there was no blood on her arm.
We were giving them medicine for free. We weren't charging. If you wanted to do this somewhere, they were used to pay as you go.
And some of them still kind of resisted. They didn't want to be vaccinated. So the smallpox that we were using became everything. If you want to become beautiful, that'll help.
We were told to do 100% coverage from the moment of birth to the moment of death. And I vaccinated infants that, just shortly after birth. And people who you knew it wouldn't do any good, but the idea is that they couldn't handle exceptions.
But often we literally had to chase them down, and it was a game sometimes, where you'd sort of be running and they'd hide and you'd go. It was hide and seek.
You were the entertainment. I mean, this was the most exciting thing that had happened to them for moons.
We went to one area, and they would have nothing to do with us. It was, I can't remember if there was another American vaccinator with me or not, but I was with 3 or 4 Afghan vaccinators, and we could not talk our way into the village. And it felt so frustrating and so hopeless because the outbreak was there. But no, they'd much rather have the outbreak than have somebody from the government go in. And
I think we were outside the village at the time. And the man apparently said, well, we don't do this kind of thing here. The head person of the village is really, we'd like to pass on this. But, here we brought you some dog to drink, have a drink, and the next village is that direction. And this supervisor just took a thing and threw it on the ground and said, we're not having any of your dog. We are here to vaccinate the people. It was a dramatic act of defiance. And, the man said, oh, I said, well, all right, he said, I'll go. And, he got us in.
At the end of the day, we'd all be in one room, and that would be the room that we would eat in and that we would sleep in. There really was no place to go for privacy. It just was socially not acceptable to be quiet. They had a value that they had to keep you occupied and happy, and it was really hard to say, yes, there's nothing wrong, but I just need some quiet time to myself.
While we were there, I think there was the first moon landing, and we tried to explain it to them, and that they would not accept that.
Because it says in the Quran that it would take, I can't remember the distance that a ladder would have to go to get to the moon, and you couldn't do that.
The host for the evening would come in with the radio and turn on Radio Kabul, and you'd listen to the radio, and then the room would kind of fill up with gawkers, onlookers, brothers-in-law, whomever.
Usually we'd be at the end of the room and it would be full of 20, 30 men who are watching us like you're watching TV.
And they'd put the light right in front of you, so you couldn't see anything. You'd see of faces out there, but it was all on you. And it was really your job to tell stories. That's sort of how you paid for your meal.
Some villages were able to afford it without too much difficulty. They had some families that were wealthy enough that they could handle having a crew of 4 or 6 come in and feed us. And other villages were so poor, but we would still be invited in, and we would still be fed.
They give you everything. And so we became aware of that over time of, these people are giving us everything. So and of course the women were the lowest on the totem pole. So anything that, if we ate everything, I always felt like if we ate everything, well then, the woman who cooked it in the kitchen may not be getting anything. So there was always that kind of tension in the day.
And we get there, and they were very hospitable, and they put us down on a mat, and we sat there and looked out over the mountain, and the guys gave us a cup of, we got 1 cup of tea, and he said that he would be back, and he came back about 2 hours later with 3 eggs. He had 3 eggs for the 2 of us, yes. And that was dinner, and I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. This is, I'm not giving enough. I can't give enough. It's not a fair exchange. They didn't have the food, and it was a violation of hospitality, I think, of their generosity.
And I wasn't trained. I wasn't a nurse or had no health professional training. Things that I'm sure I saw and didn't even begin to appreciate as far as how much the country was being impacted by the subsistence existence. And some days it was beautiful. I remember going through a poppy field one day. Other days it was kind of gloomy or cold or whatever. But I think overall a general memory was of how hospitable the Afghans were.
We would go oftentimes off with the women and the children, and we would try to communicate with the women. And oftentimes they would sometimes get up and leave entirely because maybe they just didn't think they could speak to us, or they were afraid of us suddenly, or they had never had anyone like that in their surroundings. It can be kind of scary. It was quite an ordeal to explain to them exactly what we were doing.
In some other villages where the women were really not part of the decision making, they were just told by the men, you're going to do this, and the women were apprehensive, and they should have been, because what we were doing did have risks. A lot of them, really, especially for their very small children.
Yeah, well, they were not supposed to be seen, or in some cases, not even heard. The husband would leave them home, and they would do the shopping. Yeah, and a lot of them weren't educated. I mean, they didn't go to school, but up to a certain time. And then, of course, if they did go out, they had to cover themselves.
The old women could go around anywhere, and she was just chattering away in Pashto. I couldn't understand her, and she was very angry and very bitter. And I said, what's the matter? Why is she so upset? And she had asked them where I was from, and they had said, when it's sun here, it's dark where she's at. And I had come down from Kandahar. And she said, how is it that she can come from the other side of the earth and I can't go to Kandahar? You know, because she was not allowed to do something like that.
I can remember a little girl carried my needles one day, and she, you know, where are you from? And I said, I'm from the United States. Do you know where that is? And she said, it's near Kabul. But you saw these children, and she was bright, and she was pretty, and you just, you know, she would, as soon as she reached puberty, she'd be sent off to be somebody's wife. And, you know, it was, in my heart, I was a little sad that she wouldn't experience some of the other things in this world.
The women were treated very, very poorly there by the men. In fact, you saw some really severe injuries on women because when I was alone with the women, they would take their clothes off and show me their bruising and their things, and that's just what happened there.
Most of the women that I came to know at some personal level were very bright and strong women and didn't feel like they were oppressed. So, and in the villages, what we observed, because we didn't get to be with the women in the villages, we were in the men's world all the time, the women were hardworking and or they were the wives or daughters of the wealthy and were seemed to be very pampered.
I loved the women. You could read on their faces a whole spectrum of age, of course, age-related situations, but also attitudes, friendly, some reticent, but always of interest.
When she came into Kabul to visit us, she wore chadri. And I said, you know, your husband doesn't say you have to do that. You don't have to do that. You know, we don't care. And she said, but I can't look at men if I wear. So, you know, people work out these things in different ways, you know, because inside there she could look.
I think in some families it's the children, the women, the girls, the wives are respected, are honored. Their feelings are taken into consideration, and the elders do their best to accommodate so that everybody is happy.
If you went to a Turkoman village where the women have a great economic role in the village, with their rugs in particular, they are very much part, they're not the decision makers, but they're very much part of the decision making. And things are more rational.
I love the Turkmen and Uzbek women. They were saucy, they'd talk back. The Kuchi women were tough as could be, the nomads in their tents, but they scared me. I mean, these were women who, much like gypsies, you know, they made their life moving, and you had to watch them because you turned your back and they were into your pack and into everything, and, you know, they just took what they could out of life.
Villagers would usually bring sick people or tell you about sick people, and you would be expected to take care of them.
I remember one day we were vaccinating in 3 different villages, and there were 5 children that they told me about that had been burned, and they were in different stages. Some were healing, some were, I can remember the one baby in the house that we ate at was just whimpering.
For me, one of the most moving moments was being in a little village where a teeny girl, and I don't have a complete memory, but I remember hers being so small and carrying 2 buckets on a yoke, came up and just took my hand, and it was clear I had to go where she wanted me to go, and I followed her up this path to, you know, a small house where her mother was lying down, clearly dying, and that sense of I could do nothing for her.
I felt so on the spot, I really didn't know what to do, and all these people were looking at me expectantly, and he was too, and he was just, you know, you see this pain, you know, in his eyes, and it just, my child is sick, what can I do? And so I finally said something like, well, give her some orange juice. I did, from oranges, I didn't know what else to say, and they were waiting for me to say something, so I said that. And he stopped and he looked at me and he said, oranges aren't in season.
I remember going into the first village that I saw smallpox and feeling incredibly helpless. I mean, just, I can even cry over that still, of seeing, families that are sitting there and, me being an American, and we're such great doers, and we're such great fixers, and there's got to be some way we can fix this, and recognizing that we couldn't do anything.
The problems were so enormous and you could do so little. Although sometimes so little could do a huge amount. There was one time we were staying with this wonderful family, and the older wife had a rash that she just couldn't get rid of. And she couldn't go to the doctor. Her husband had to go and explain what was the problem, and he came back with all this stuff. I happened to have some calamine lotion, and it just cleared it right up. And that was, was kind of magic.
There's things that we didn't talk about, and that's the challenge of vaccinating when you know your needle's only been cleaned in hot tea water, because that's all you had.
I was a medical technologist, and we think in terms of if you're going to give somebody an injection or a shot, that it should be using clean needles.
And alcohol is prohibited, even isopropyl alcohol, so you couldn't flame them.
Now, were some of them used twice? Well, we're not sure.
Thank God this was before the age of AIDS.
I wish we could have done it in a way that didn't leave me so uncomfortable about any time you break the skin on an Afghan with no antibiotics.
You had the World Health Organization in charge of the whole program, and they made out a grand plan of how we were going to eradicate smallpox in Afghanistan, and they had the schedule set up, and we were going to spend the winter in the mountains when everything was frozen and all the nomads were in the south, and we were going to spend the summers in the desert when all the nomads were in the mountains, and we were going to fry. So we had to have a little, reinterpretation of that schedule. And that happened. You had to submit the payroll in 6 copies of that to the United Nations to get reimbursement for the Afghan vaccinators. And of course you were supposed to get a signature for all the vaccinators, and they were all over the country and you couldn't get them. And the whole thing was, really pretty much a work of fiction. But the best part was that the Ministry of Health really didn't have any paper.
We came finally to this little mud building that they said was a clinic. It was one of the few health clinics. And you looked on the shelves and there were a few vials of medication, but there was very, very little. And that was where we were going to sleep because that was the only building. And so we took out our sleeping bags, or we took the quilts, and we just lay down and went to sleep. And I remember looking around, and I had one of those moments, where I suddenly saw us doing this. And it was like a lantern light, and that was the only light. Say, this is so odd, but it's just a quality that I think probably the people in that group had, and you had to have. You just did what was there, and you ate what was there, and they said it was time to sleep. You just lay down and went to sleep, and you just, you had to be extremely flexible and adaptable to do that kind of job. And that was sort of the moment that it hit me. So.
When I went to work at in the Ministry of Health, they all laughed at my Farsi. It was sort of like Appalachian Farsi. It was village Farsi, and that's who we related to, and that's kind of where we fit in. And we could, joke around and feel completely comfortable.
When we used to go to the tea place, I'd put on a little act, so the Afghans, could hear it and see it. Whatever I said, it made them laugh.
The first question that would be asked was, do you have a book? Kitab Dori, which means, do you have a holy book? And once you figured out you know, what they were talking about. You say, yes, I've got the Old Testament. And then you could talk about these stories. I never heard a Muslim put down a Christian.
I did have people who wouldn't shake my hand. They'd cover their hand with a robe to shake my hand because they didn't want to touch the flesh of an infidel. And I think it was more an infidel than a woman, but probably a combination of the two. But they felt that they had to make that gesture because I was a guest in their country.
Even when you are so totally out of their cultural experience, and yet they're still respectful and kind.
But we didn't fit in a female category. We didn't feel in either of the two female categories, and therefore we were sort of in no man's land. And that gave us a great deal more freedom than we would have had otherwise.
I knocked on the door, and someone answered it, opened the door, and I started speaking English. And I said, hey, I'm the Avon lady. I'm here to vaccinate you all for smallpox, so just line everybody up right now. And I wasn't very nice. The last person I vaccinated turned around and looked at me, and she said, excuse me, but is this injection for cholera in English? And I was absolutely humiliated. But she was so gracious to me. We had tea afterwards.
After you created chaos in their lives and upset people, and then they wanted to hang on to you and wanted you to sit down and have tea, and you didn't have time for that, but they filled your pockets with, if they had them, with fruit or nuts and raisins, and yeah, just an extraordinary people.
I was alone, and the Afghan women didn't even go into the tea house, but fool that I was, I went in and the tea house was, it's like a platform. You don't have tables and chairs, but you kind of sit on this platform. You take your shoes off and sit, and everybody's sitting on the same platform. And I sort of ended up in the middle and was an object of great curiosity. So I ate, and, you know, and when I finished, I felt something pelting me on the back, and I thought, what the hell's this? And I turned around, and many of the men had hard candies, and they were throwing them to me, not at me, but to me. I mean, God forbid they should talk to me, but they were trying their best to be hospitable.
She went over and picked up this bowl off of the ground and told me to sit down, and handed me the bowl. And it was this kind of pale yellow substance that had hair in it, just little bits of hair. And it was butter that she had just finished churning. And I used to churn butter at my grandmother's house when I was a little kid. And she kept motioning for me to eat it, and I didn't want to be rude. And that was that was very important for me, not to be rude, to be polite. And she gave me some bread, and I started eating, and I was trying to not eat the hair, but I ended up, I'm sure, eating some of it. But it was a very nice little interlude with this lady.
You know, that's one of the Islamic messages that I think the Afghans have taken to the highest level, that, you know, you don't turn people away.
And I remember we were vaccinating on Christmas Day and walking through those villages, and it was as though you were in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago.
Alexander had been there, and going up into Vaizabad in Nuristan and seeing the remnants of the Alexander army, and going into Zarajat and seeing the remnants of the Timur Lane. That was incredible. And then the Kuchis and all their stuff going up and down, and it was just fascinating.
Dust, dryness, dirt, rocks, very few trees. Once you see that, you figure there can't, what is there? But the opposite of that is that they have over the centuries, no doubt, figured out how to use water judiciously to the point where they can grow an abundance and wealth of food and fruit and grains and whatever that is phenomenal in its bounty.
I learned a lot about the simplicity and how happy people could be, you know, at that time without all the amenities.
I really enjoyed the children. And what I discovered about the kids was that, you know, as children in this country, we're used to having toys and whatever we have, or if you want to have a game, you actually had a board game, or you had real marbles. They had stones, but they played the same games, and they laughed the same. They were absolutely delightful.
The people we were working with were, I don't know, just these wonderful people. I just thought they were special. You know, at any moment they'd break into song. And of course, like many of the folks here, they did sound effects along with the song, you know, the tabla and the harmonium. So somebody would be doing the rhythm of the harmonium, somebody else, dum, 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 dum.
I enjoyed the camaraderie with the guys. I learned how to play poker real quick and learned, you know, diamonds, spades, all that kind of stuff. Even learned how to cheat just because that was part of the game in Afghanistan.
I thought the Afghan vaccinators were very protective, and I think it has to do with the culture of the Afghan males. Afghan males protect their women, and we happened to be women, and they knew what our charge was. They knew what their charge was, and at least I had a very good experience with our Afghan vaccinators who became our friends.
In Afghanistan, certainly money helps. You can you can put chairs in your parlor instead of the tushaks on the floor. But I think more important to them is that their family is comfortable, secure, and safe, and everybody's getting along, and the children are being reared properly. And I don't think education back then may be different now, but among many, education was not the standard either. It was a personal character that was more important maybe than any search for material wealth or comfort.
There's something to be said about knowing your place in society, having a role, and knowing what's expected of you. And that was the case with Afghan women. They had a wonderful sisterhood among them. There was laughter and seemingly joy in their lives, despite the fact that they had nothing.
They had such limits put on them, and they found us so strange that it was hard to relate to them. And I can't remember what village it was, but I got to just talk with a couple of women. Really hit me that they were just like me.
They were perhaps more curious about very personal things.
They'd ask you, who are you? You know, where'd you come from? What are you doing? Are you married?
No, I don't have any children. And the ladies found that very interesting, that I was unmarried.
And very sad that we were there all alone and by ourselves and this far away from home. And what about your mother?
Does your father know, you know, that you're here? How would your parents let you, you know, out wandering around like this? And what's your dowry? How many cows will, you know, your father give when you get married and you aren't married? And what, you know, they kept trying to fit us into their world.
The women in the family generally piped up amongst the other women, and they might talk privately to their husbands, but they didn't talk in these family gatherings. But Sharjan would, and they would listen to her.
I met a woman in particular, and her name was Tajwar Kakar, and she lived in Kunduz. She was very westernized. I cut her hair short. She wore suits. She had a couple children at that time. Her husband had another wife, too. And Doris Lessing had a book about Afghanistan. And there was a chapter dedicated to Tajwar Kakar and how she had helped bring money to the people, kind of like the underground during the Russian invasion and things like this. So I knew that Afghan women could be very powerful.
And I came to this broken down compound wall, and there was a lady. She was probably about 35, but she looked about 20 years older, and she was sitting there. And she she was blind, but she also had bone TB, because her neck had the open sore there, and she knew she was dying. And I explained to her why we were there, and she immediately called her children on it. And she just said, I want them to have everything to protect them. And she was just a very lovely woman. And I just said, well, I walked out of that compound and I said, the world doesn't owe me a damn thing. And that's the lesson of life.
You know, I went sort of small and narrow and kind of closed up, and the experience basically just destroyed so much ignorance on my part that it was like somebody turned on a light.
And I had a friend visit after I actually had finished the Peace Corps. And he arrived in Herat, and after walking around for, I don't know, an hour or so, he said, do you realize you've been living in a museum? This is, you know, it's just so ancient and so completely intact. And I had just begun to take, you know, it didn't seem strange to me at all that we were riding around in horse and buggies. And
one night it was just so real, it was just unreal, in that I was sitting up on top of this mesa in this guest house with all these men and eating rice, and I just had this notion that this really wasn't happening to me, and the only way that I could verify this was to have somebody come in and take a picture with one of those old-fashioned press cameras that are huge, that have the giant flash bulb. And I just visualized this person busting in the door and the light of the flash, and thinking, now I'll know it's real. When I get so old that I can't remember this or it seems unreal, then I'll have something to tell me that this was a real experience. You go home and you'll have culture shock. Well, I don't know if that's an adequate description of it, because you think a shock is something that is short and you know, you get over it. And I don't think my culture shock was short. And I probably still haven't gotten over it.
It was weird. It was as if I had never left. On the other hand, I wasn't, I guess it was disappointing. I wasn't sure that I really wanted to come home.
Everything is so different. I mean, I got home and I tried to open a Kleenex box, you know, the kind that I couldn't figure out how you did it.
I just drifted aimlessly for a long time.
It was like I couldn't make decisions. I thought, did I lose my confidence?
I wanted to be Afghan. I mean, I was running around in tombans for a year, and people were going, you know, what's wrong with this lady? You know, I didn't want to show my bare legs.
It was like I didn't want to get back into these routines of, you know, normal life.
And I felt angry. I would look at the country in a very critical way.
Also, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, and so I had to stop and think about what I was going to do next.
It started a career path for me, and eventually I went, like you said, I went to CSU and got a bachelor's in education and master's in training and development. You know, I had always felt as though my profession, my skill wasn't, you know, I wasn't a teacher and I wasn't, you know, one of these Wellesley, Berkeley graduates. And so when people would say to me, you know, what do you do for a living? I would always say, I'm a hairdresser. And they would say, what? I'm a hairdresser. And then finally, you know, I said, I'm going to be a teacher. So I became a teacher. And they say, what do you do? And I said, I'm a teacher. And they would say, what do you teach? And I'd go, hairdressing. And so
I came back for a few months, and then I went back as another Peace Corps volunteer. I think in Kenya I was 8 years.
Peace Corps was key. Peace Corps was it that, basically all thoughts of me living and working in the United States were pretty much gone. I didn't want to. And I'm not saying I had a real bee in my bonnet. It's just that I felt that I really felt more comfortable in places like Afghanistan.
Once I got to Kenya, I knew this is the place I wanted to be.
After I got home and Bill and I got married, we ended up adopting 2 kids from India, from Mother Teresa's group. And that extended the lesson because one of them was very easy and the other one was an incredible challenge.
You have a woman who had 11 children, 7 die. That's part of it.
They have a huge ability to accept things the way they are, and that could be tied in with their faith.
Just accepting something that happens and you just go on with life. That was something that would have helped me a lot in my life.
I was off to save the world, and then of course you get humbled in Afghanistan. I'm sure other people have said that, is that you learn more from them and you save yourself basically.
None of us, I don't think any of us in that group could possibly have left that country without appreciating water.
I was never a deep thinker, and it caused me to question a lot of the things that I had believed in.
I got somewhat involved with domestic violence, and not with the police so much, but with the homes, that safe homes.
I shudder to think what my life might have been like had I not had the Peace Corps experience, what direction I might have gone in. It's just to have that awareness of culture and how much we're sort of bound by that.
This is what Afghanistan gave me, was such a perspective of how people live and die and believe differently and get their needs met under a completely, totally different system than we have.
And we may have hugely different perspectives, but when it comes right down to looking into somebody's eyes, we can recognize each other. We really can.
They say there's no more smallpox in the world.
Oh, no, that wasn't true.
I didn't believe it.
After we left, it was not finished, and the Afghans continued on.
Well, it felt like I was a part, a small part, but I was a part of that.
It's a horrible, horrible disease. I think that people were spared just incredible suffering.
I'd like to say, yes, I went there, I made an impact in the endemic area.
In one way, it was worth it to the Afghans because they had, sometimes it was their first contact with any Afghan from the city and any contact with a foreigner, and that they saw, in some sense, that the government was concerned about their health.
I've often wondered about the people that we saved, whether those are what happened to them with everything that happened in Afghanistan. Did we save them? Did we just put off? But sometimes having death put off is enough.
I had a great deal of respect for the women that were able to endure.
It takes a certain mental mindset to be able to do that.
There were times when we first started going out, certainly we went in pairs, and there were times when we would really rely on each other, either because of language or just having somebody to share the experience, whether it was positive or negative.
I remember being so sick in that hotel in Kabul I had mentioned, and having to have 2 friends wait out in the hall so they could keep anyone else from using the bathroom, because we didn't know if I was going to be taking a dump or throwing up in there, or both simultaneously, and they were just trying to keep it free. Well, those are the kind of things you did for each other, and here you can't even talk about those things.
We knew all our stories. I mean, that's what we had. We didn't have all these other distractions and things to do. We had to fall back on, what is probably the older mode of, interacting, sit around, talk to each other.
I know that they would make my day. They would say something that would encourage me. So even though they might not have known that was the part that they were playing, it really was significant.
We've met several times lately, and for reunions, not everyone's come, but they're just like such a special time. The vibes are whoa, whoa, whoa. It's just so much respect and love and understanding.
I see more empathy from all of the group as we get older, I think, and we have these reunions, and a real interest in each other as your life may not be like mine or maybe different, but a curiosity and interest, which I think is probably what made us good candidates for this program in the first place.
It is a wonderful country and a hard country. And so the experience there was one thing. What the country really is totally another thing. And I'm so hopeful that somehow I will get to be Afghanistan again.
Sum up Afghanistan in one word. That's not fair. Tragic right now. Tragic. That's one word.
I felt terribly vulnerable at times being a woman. I didn't like the fact that I had to be careful not to look a man in the eye, because suddenly it would be as if I was making saying that I'm available. I didn't like having to be protected by other people. The dogs scared the daylights out of me, and I had this illusion I'd be brave, but every house you knocked at, there was a good chance there was a dog. I hated being sick, and for some reason, every microbe in the world liked me. Afghan bathrooms were experienced. I've thrown up in many. I lost my prescription glasses down one. I don't know if it's come up, but we spent half our time talking about what kind of diarrhea we had. So many of these little things meant that there wasn't a big place of comfort inside myself. And at first, I remember counting the days. It's hard on my body, it's wearing, and I don't like these people. And then I found out that these people weren't these people. There were individuals I didn't like, and there were others. You know how first it's the whole group, and then you start to open your eyes. She's one of those people that I don't know why, and occasionally you meet them, that without saying anything, we just connected. And she just took my hand, and we sat together and had tea, and I felt that here I was, this short little American who was butchering her language, who represented wealth, and she was this just majestic village woman who obviously lived a hard life. Her skin was like leather, and she was one of those grand dams. There was a human connection that we just made without saying anything that said, I'm interested in you, and you're interested in me, and let's sit for a moment, and maybe we can't do it with words, but we can, try, and we can sit together and share tea and make a basic human connection, which is more about being alike than being different. There's so much I learned in that sense of a magic moment, and having looked back now, those magic moments we can't program. We try to. We set them up with our kids and our friends, and they don't happen on schedule. But when they happen, you have to go with them and take them as this gift that life gives you, and know you'd like more of them, and wish you had more of them. And then when they happen, to savor them. And in many ways, with all the pain, Afghanistan was a magic moment.
They had no sense of the world beyond the village. They were very, very sheltered, but they weren't sad about that. They didn't show any, gosh, I wish I could be traveling around by myself out in the world independent like you.
But people did run away, and people did attack, women did attack volunteers. They attacked me once, which I thought was a little excessive, but...
I suddenly got the experience of I was called half Afghan, by the Afghans here in this country. And it was like, I almost felt at times when we were socializing that I was an outsider in my own country, and that felt uncomfortable.
I think it's difficult for them now if they had my name, because the name Omar, of course, is not a popular one. And in the culture here, if people know anything at all about anything in the world, they know that name. And so I suppose in many respects that's difficult.
Coming into town was kind of like the circus coming, because we had, leading the way were the soldiers, and they were holding hands or having had a flower behind their ears or carrying our sleeping bags or whatever. And then you'd see the male vaccinators, and they'd be trudging along next. And then bringing up the rear with the backpacks would be the Peace Corps vaccinators.
It was also the time that women's lib was first coming around in this country. And we kept getting news about this, which it's sort of difficult to understand in the context of Afghanistan. What are they complaining about over there?
He wanted to marry me, and he wrote to my father. And the poor guy, the letter came to my dad and wanted me to come back and marry him. And that was something. I think I still have the letter, actually.
But it was that, oh, that must have been so exciting. Tell me all about it. And you start to talk, and then they're gone. They only wanted, a 5-second clip.
Was that frustrating?
Yeah.
As a little girl, when I say little, I mean like 10 years old, I used to sit on the steps of my neighbor and say that I'm going to go to Africa and I'm going to marry this king and he's going to give me diamond rings on each finger. That was my desire. I did go to Africa. I did meet my king, but he didn't have diamonds.
I think we had the interest of, oh, you went to the Peace Corps. Isn't that wonderful? Oh, Afghanistan. Now, did you know Aunt Millie's going to the mall today? Or, gosh, we would show our slides, and I really feel for most people it's about 5 minutes interest.
I didn't go over with any idea that I was going to save the world, yada, yada, yada. And when I joined CARE, I didn't go in with that either. I wanted to be doing that kind of work and living in those cultures and learning from them. And enjoying, simply enjoying. Okay? I mean, I really like to eat dust.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, everybody was curious, wanted to know, and I couldn't really talk about it. Yeah.
How come?
I don't know.
Did that last?
I would say it lasted for a year or two. Yeah.
Well, they did, but not to the level that I probably wanted to talk about it. I had all these, experiences, just as I'm talking to you, and I could probably go on with more and more stories, type of thing, at a great level of detail. So, they wanted to hear, and then you could tell they were getting restless, and oh yeah, well that was, interesting sort of stuff.
So I went back to Aberdeen, South Dakota, and I went around to some public schools because I was the only Peace Corps person ever. No one ever went to Afghanistan from South Dakota. I mean, nobody went to Boston from South Dakota. So this was a big deal in Aberdeen. So when I got back, and all my friends in public schools, whatever, they would say, "Oh, you come to my class."
I guess that's some of the experiences. Walking into the meat market and picking out your piece of meat and hoping to high heaven you weren't buying camel, because camel was so tough. And going home and cooking it and finding out that indeed it was so tough and you knew you'd gotten camel.
And recognizing that the perspectives were okay, that there were other perspectives, they didn't have to be mine. But when all is said and done, it was like, well, how welcoming are you? It's like that salam alaikum, that meeting between people.
Like this fella who just recently wrote a book about walking across Afghanistan in the middle of winter in the footsteps of, was it Alexander?
I don't know.
Yeah. So, our experience pales in comparison to that, and I probably do too much.
Saved, though?
I cherish the connection, always have and always will. As I mentioned, the work that they did and millions of others over the world did something that's unique in human history, which is eradicate a disease, and a very, very awful disease named smallpox, that killed millions, that blinded millions, that scarred millions. And that's a real accomplishment. And I don't know if they themselves appreciate what they did, but I sure do. I think they're heroes.
I have a ukulele, and we made these great songs up. And there was one that was really quite rank. You know, we used Afghan words, and and I was so empowered by the experience of being with this group that when I went home for Christmas, now we had a little break there. We hadn't intended to go home for Christmas, but we were all able to do that. I remember taking my ukulele with my family, sitting in the kitchen, singing this raunchy song, and they were appalled.
We'd been told for 2 months what a filthy, dirty place we were going to, and don't drink the water, and when flies are going like this, their legs are going like this, they're defecating. We learned more about flies than you ever wanted to know. And we landed in Kabul on this incredibly beautiful, crystal clear day, and I got off the plane. Oh, it smells so. I was about to say good, and I realized, oh my God, it's not supposed to.
England had given us these beautiful Land Rovers through WHO and everything, and we got all our vaccine from Russia, and it just sounded so international. You know, I remember feeling just so important that, oh my gosh, all these big words and all these international things, you know. So But it wasn't really as glamorous as it sounded.
We were friendly with the guys pretty early on, and they did come to the house and have tea and whatever we cooked for them, and we played volleyball. And of course, there was an Afghan vaccinator woman who would come, and you couldn't toss a ball to her because she'd never had that experience. It would just bounce off of her.
If you see compounds over there, especially the ones that are owned by fairly wealthy people, the mud wall's fairly high, maybe 12 feet high, a little less depending on how wealthy the person is. But the main entrance is, there's not much wood, as you can imagine, not many trees around, but those who have money, of course, can purchase, build, or whatever, these massive doors, which are the main entrance to the compound. And they're wood, and sometimes decorated, carved, various things. So, I don't know, the door to me is a symbol of not only an entrance to any compound, but an entrance to that culture.
Often word would get around that there was a foreign doctor in the villages, and we had a couple of heartbreaking situations where one father had heard the word, and he had traveled for about a day with his very, very sick child. I think she had protein malnutrition. He carried her on his back, and we were at the side of the river when he arrived. We had just crossed it. It was very icy, and I think our counterparts were still on the other side, and we didn't quite know what to do. This was still in training because she was so sick, and she really didn't look like she was going to make it. But we were given, the Peace Corps gave us I think a medicine kit to take with us, and it had some serious antibiotics in it and all kinds of vitamins. And I remember that kit was over on the other side, and we had just crossed it, and we just took our shoes off and ran across and brought the kit back. And fumbling around to try to find, we just wanted to give them something, maybe to give them hope, but so we pulled out vitamins. It was pathetic.
I decided for a number of reasons that I wanted to be in one place, and I ended up going out to Herat to teach. But at the same time, I would vaccinate out of Herat, and then there was a cholera epidemic that came through that was quite serious at the time, and so I did some cholera vaccinating.
What did you teach?
I taught English as a second language, and it was interesting. I was basically a person that integrated. I was the first woman to integrate the boys' school, the boys' high school, which was another whole adventure. And I remember walking into my classes and the principal introducing me to the boys, and one of the boys piping up and saying, "How can this be? How can a cow teach me?"
What they did think was I wasn't from America. By being black, I wasn't from America. They thought I was from Africa. Yeah, which was nothing wrong with that, but you couldn't convince them that I was from America. And there was one of our counterpart had come to New York, and he had gone on the subway, and he said black people live underground because he saw so many black people in the subway.
I'd gone back and was with the women, and there was a young teen. I'm guessing she was 12 to 14, and occasionally we would talk about different things. And one of the things she mentioned was that she'd been betrothed. She'd been betrothed years ago, and her wedding was coming up, and she really did not want to get married. She said, "What can I do?" She'd never seen the bridegroom. She had no idea how she was going to deal with it, and she really didn't want to. And unfortunately, I didn't have a really good answer for her.
Sometimes when you were traipsing through the field, the vaccinators would just pick up a melon and slice it open, and you'd have a little snack. And melons right from the field were so delicious. They were not like you buy in the store today. They were so sweet and wonderful and pure and fresh.
When it was very hot in Kandahar in the south, we would get up very, very early in the morning and start out like about 5 in the morning or so, because it would get so hot, and then we would have a long rest period and in the middle of the day. And we would lie down on these little, I've forgotten the name already, little little pads, and they would give you quilts. We had sleeping bags, and sometimes we used it, and sometimes used the quilts, and there would be flies everywhere, of course, and so we had these coverings, but I can remember how hot it was, and you wanted to cover yourself up so the flies wouldn't be landing on you all the time. On the other hand, then you would start to suffocate to death. So they were not terribly comfortable siestas, but we would sort of wait them out.
We had no cigarettes, and we smoked all the time. And there was no little store. And for some reason, we were on camels that day. And we were out, and one of the vaccinators went ahead, borrowed a kid's bicycle, biked up to the nearest little town, which he didn't know where there was a little store that sold cigarettes, and bought a pack of 10 that he came by, and he handed each of us one. I remember riding on a camel, smoking a cigarette, and thinking, this is heaven, having a camel on a camel.
There was sort of a feeling of adventure among many. There was also like wanting to be of service, but that I don't think would ever cut it for 2 years. I think you had to have also some vim and vigor and adventure and romance and that kind of, at least I had it, so.
Because we were foreign and because we were doing odd things, we could relax, we could do weird things. Cat White came up to visit, and we told them we wanted to do bushkashi. So they got us 2 donkeys. And Cat and I played bushkashi players. And tried to knock, with the whole village watching, just trying to knock each other off the donkeys.
Living in Kandahar, you would walk down the street and children would throw rocks at you and yell, Haraji, strange, foreigner at you. So that's not a comfortable thing. I mean, people that you would know personally, any families that you would know personally were wonderful to you. And that, as in our vaccinating experiences, I talked, said before, you were treated as an honored guest. But if you were just walking down a street in one of the cities, you were likely to have children harass you that way. And in Kabul, in our neighborhood, that would sometimes happen also. So that was hard. It got increasingly hard. Instead of something you grew used to, for me, I became more sensitive the longer I was there. Just think, don't you know we're here doing good? We're here helping your country.
My husband and I had one telephone and one television set in the whole house the whole time we were raising our children. They didn't have Nintendo. We didn't have a telephone when we were first married for the first year. So, I'm not saying this is good by any stretch, but it's just something that you really need less than you think you do.
If you want to begin by giving your name and when and where you were a Peace Corps volunteer.
I'm Jill Vickers. When I got back with these friends who'd been in Afghanistan, I realized that I needed their memories to reconstitute mine. I just put it aside. I knew it had 2 profound influences on me. One was the man that I chose to marry and to whom I am still married. And I realized that by coming to appreciate and respect and love these Afghans who were not educated, formally educated, that it was okay to love this man. And the other thing was, when I came back, I looked around at where I had grown up. My siblings had done what was expected. They'd gone off to college and then found careers in lively, interesting places like Austin, Texas, and Boston, Massachusetts. I saw the horizon, these beautiful wavy lines of the Adirondacks and the Green Mountains of the Champlain Valley, and I said, this is my Watan, this is my heartland. And I met a woman who is a wonderful editor, and she did an interview of the training director with me and got very excited about the project, and so I had a partner. They started contributing money to pay the videographer and pay the editor and some money so that we could fly to where people were if they couldn't come to us in Middlebury. I just realized what it means to sit down and ask somebody to tell you about their life. It's a very special thing that you wind up being given. You find out things that are not, haven't been brought to the surface. We have become much more tightly bound together. The communications back and forth, and a woman none of us had seen since Afghanistan, the woman who went to Kenya for 8 years as a volunteer after Afghanistan, was not going. She said, "I can't remember more than 5 minutes of the experience. I don't know what you want me to talk about, Jill." She finally agreed to meet me in New York at her sister's apartment, and of course, in fact, she did remember 1 hour and a half worth of things to say, like everybody else. But because she'd gone to Kenya and married a Kenyan and raised her children there, she was out of the country. So she lost track of all of us, and that whole thing in Afghanistan, was so remote for her. And she had since moved back, but we just didn't know where she was. Just recently, she called me. She doesn't use email. She doesn't use telephones. She called and said, "Jill, I'm going back to Kenya. I'm going to miss the reunion in October, and I knew I couldn't leave the country without calling and telling you." And I said, "Right, Kat, you're right. You would have been in so much trouble." And she called another woman in the group and told her. So that was just, and she, as she said it, she knew that I knew that she was back in the group.